By mid-December 1950, the trap had failed. More than 10,000 Marines, soldiers, and Allied troops had fought their way out of the mountains around the Chosin Reservoir, carrying wounded men, artillery, trucks, and tanks down a single frozen road. Behind them lay shattered roadblocks, abandoned positions, and a battlefield so cold that blood froze on uniforms and morphine stiffened inside its tubes. It should not have been possible. 12 Chinese divisions had been committed to the wider campaign. The road south had been cut again and again. One bridge had been blown apart above a ravine. An entire American task force had already been destroyed as an organized unit. Yet the encirclement never became annihilation. To understand why, rewind to November 27, when Chinese troops poured out of the hills and attacked isolated camps around the reservoir. They believed they were surrounding scattered units. They were actually attacking the pieces of a fortress that could move. The road was supposed to trap them. Instead, it became the weapon that carried them out. In November 1950, the war in Korea appeared to be ending. Pyongyang had fallen. United Nations forces were driving north. Some patrols were approaching the Yalu River, and General Douglas MacArthur's headquarters spoke openly of bringing troops home by Christmas. The North Korean army had been broken and pushed toward the Chinese border. On the maps at X-Corps headquarters, speed looked like the final weapon. Major General Edward Armand wanted his forces pushed deeper into northeastern Korea before the enemy could recover. The mountains were severe and the distances enormous, but American aircraft controlled the sky. Trucks carried fuel and ammunition. The offensive only had to keep moving. Major General Oliver P. Smith saw something else. His 1st Marine Division was not advancing as one compact formation. It was being stretched north along a thin mountain corridor from the coast toward the Chosin Reservoir. At one stage, elements of the division occupied an axis roughly 170 miles long. Every mile added another bridge, another convoy, and another section of frozen road that had to remain open. A mechanized army without its road is not mobile, it is stranded. Smith had already received a warning. On November 2, near Sudong, the 7th Marines collided with troops from the Chinese 124th Division. 44 Marines were killed and 162 wounded before the Chinese suddenly withdrew from contact on November 7. The withdrawal encouraged the wrong conclusion. To many senior commanders, the Chinese force looked limited, perhaps a delaying screen protecting the border. The road north was still open. The enemy had pulled back. The offensive could continue. Smith did not treat the empty hills as proof that the danger had disappeared. He slowed the advance and began building what looked like ordinary logistics. At Kotori, south of the reservoir, Marines stockpiled fuel, ammunition, food, and cold weather equipment. About 11 road miles farther north at Hagaruri, engineers began cutting an airstrip from frozen ground. Artillery positions were prepared. Supply dumps grew beside tents, trucks, and tracked vehicles. They created places where a scattered division could stop, turn, and fight. Almond continued to demand movement. Smith continued north, but resisted scattering his regiments faster than the road could support them. By late November, the 5th and 7th Marines were concentrated near Udamni, west of the reservoir. Hagaruri sat behind them. Koto-ri stood farther south. Between these positions ran one twisting road through Toktong Pass. If that road failed, the regiments at Udamni could be isolated from their supplies, artillery, and escape route. Yet Chinese soldiers were already moving through the mountains at night, hiding by day beneath white camouflage and pine branches. They were not preparing to delay the American advance, they were preparing to erase it. On the night of November 27, the mountains around Chosin seemed to come alive. At Udamni, the 5th and 7th Marines occupied a high valley west of the reservoir. 11 road miles to the southeast, Toktong Pass controlled the only route back to Hagaruri. Hagaruri guarded the southern end of the reservoir, while Koto-ri stood farther down the road toward the coast. East of the frozen lake, Army units of Regimental Combat Team 31 occupied another exposed line. Narrow roads clung to slopes and disappeared between ridges. A few high points could dominate miles of movement. At night, the temperature fell to roughly 20 degrees below zero, sometimes lower. Rifle bolts stiffened. Canteens froze solid. Bare skin could freeze to metal. Then the bugles began. Whistles answered from separate ridges. Dark figures in padded uniforms crossed the snow in files, carrying rifles, grenades, and demolition charges. Chinese infantry used ravines and folds in the ground that daylight aircraft could not see. Flares burst above the snow. Mortar rounds struck tents, gun pits, and command posts. At Udamni, troops from the Chinese 79th and 89th Divisions attacked the marine perimeter from several directions. East of the reservoir, the 80th Division struck the scattered army positions. The attacks were not random. Picture the battlefield from General Song Shilun's side of the mountains. He did not see a coherent fortress. He saw separated camps connected by one vulnerable road. Cut Toktong Pass. Crush the units east of the reservoir. Break Hagaruri before reinforcements could gather. Then destroy the isolated groups one by one. It was a rational plan because the American deployment invited it. Song also believed only one Marine regiment had reached Udamni. In reality, both the 5th and 7th Marines were there, supported by artillery. The Chinese had found the right weakness. They had misjudged what was sitting on top of it. At Udamni, Marines fought from shallow foxholes hacked into frozen ground. Some positions changed hands in darkness, so complete that men fired at muzzle flashes. Grenades rolled down icy slopes. Wounded men froze where stretcher teams could not reach them. If the perimeter split before daylight, the road south would not become an escape route. It would become a corridor lined with isolated survivors. But the line did not collapse. Marine artillery crews fired from maps barely visible under blackout conditions. Forward observers called missions onto ridges only a few hundred yards from friendly foxholes. By dawn, Chinese troops had penetrated parts of the perimeter, but had not destroyed the force at Udamni. That failure created the first debt in Song's plan. The encirclement depended on speed. Every camp had to be broken before the others could react. Once Udamni survived the first night, Smith could begin treating the road not as a supply line, but as a sequence of defensive problems. The next problem stood above Toktong Pass. Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, had been placed on a hill commanding roughly 5 kilometers of road. It was one company. Its position looked small beside divisions moving through the mountains. Yet, if that hill fell, 2 Marine regiments at Udamni could be sealed off from Hagaruri. The Chinese believed they were attacking a hill. They were reaching for the hinge of the entire escape. Fox Company had been sent to Toktong Pass to guard a road. By the morning of November 28, the road was gone. Chinese troops had cut the main supply route on both sides of the company's hill. Udamni lay to the northwest. Hagaruri lay to the southeast. Frozen rock made deep foxholes almost impossible. The ridgeline offered little shelter from mortar fire. Once darkness returned, Chinese infantry could climb through ravines hidden from aircraft and artillery observers. The first assault nearly ended the fight. Gunfire erupted from a rocky knoll above the command post. 3rd Platoon was overrun so quickly that Chinese soldiers passed the listening post occupied by Private First Class Hector Cafferata. He came out of his sleeping bag without time to put on his boots. Fighting in his socks, he fired into the attackers and used an entrenching tool to knock grenades back down the slope. One grenade landed among wounded Marines. Cafferata grabbed it and threw it away, but it exploded as it left his hand. He kept fighting. By dawn, his feet were badly frostbitten. Across the position, the line bent inward. Chinese troops reached the command post, where the fight became close enough for rifles to lose their distance. Wounded men were carried into a Korean hut converted into an aid station. Morphine syrettes had frozen solid, forcing Navy corpsmen to warm them in their mouths. Plasma froze too. 20 Marines were killed that first night. 54 were wounded. Daylight brought Australian Mustang fighters, but not rescue. The road remained blocked, and Fox Company had too many casualties to withdraw without leaving men behind. Captain William E. Barber chose to stay. On the second night, he was shot in the leg. The bullet lodged near his hip. He moved along the line with a makeshift crutch, then allowed Marines to carry him on a stretcher so he could direct the defense from one threatened sector to another. The order to hold was not heroic rhetoric, it was arithmetic. One company remained on the hill. 2 regiments remained beyond it. Every hour Fox Company survived gave Udamni another hour to organize a breakout. Chinese troops attacked again. A voice from the darkness called on the Marines to surrender. The answer came from 81mm mortars firing illumination rounds. followed by rifles and machine guns beneath the white glare. Ammunition, food, and medical supplies shrank. Aircraft dropped bundles onto the hill. Some landed inside the perimeter, others vanished down the slopes. 6 of the company's 7 officers were eventually wounded. At Udumne, Lieutenant Colonel Raymond G. Davis understood that using the road would mean walking directly into the roadblocks. His 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, moved instead across the mountains. The route offered only snow-covered ridges, steep descents, and the risk of becoming lost between Chinese positions. If Davis chose the wrong ridge, Fox Company would face another night alone. Near midday on December 2, figures appeared through the snow above Toktong Pass. They were Davis's Marines. Fox Company had held for 5 days. Its final losses included 26 killed, 89 wounded, and 3 missing, nearly half the company. The Chinese had isolated the hill exactly as planned. What they had not understood was that isolation worked both ways. Every force committed against Barber was a force not closing somewhere else. Fox Hill looked like one trapped company. It had become the door through which 2 regiments would escape. East of the reservoir, the Encirclement did what it was designed to do. The army force there was not a complete regiment behind one perimeter. It was a collection of units arriving on different days and occupying separate positions along the frozen eastern shore. Supporting tanks remained farther south near Hagaruri. When the Chinese attacked on November 27, the formation had strength on paper but gaps on the ground. The reservoir lay to the west. Chinese-held ridges rose to the east. Between them ran one narrow road connecting the northern and southern positions. The soldiers could see the ice. They could not see the infantry moving above them in darkness. The Chinese 80th Division struck both perimeters. Men fought beside 105mm howitzers, ammunition trailers, tents, and vehicles trapped inside shrinking defensive circles. Anti-aircraft guns were lowered toward the ridge lines and fired into infantry at close range. The shells tore gaps through assaults, but every attack consumed ammunition that could not be replaced. Colonel Alan McLean tried to consolidate the positions on November 29. In the confusion, he approached soldiers he believed were Americans. They were Chinese. McLean was shot, captured, and later died of his wounds. Command passed to Lieutenant Colonel Don Faith. By November 30, the task force had more than 400 wounded. 2 attempts by its separated tank company and a scratch force from Hagaruri failed to break through. Icy roads stopped vehicles. Faulty communications kept Faith from knowing how close the rescue attempts had come. That night, Chinese attacks nearly destroyed the perimeter. By the morning of December 1, the wounded had risen to almost 600, roughly 1/4 of the force. One more night could finish them. Faith ordered a breakout. About 30 trucks were packed with wounded men. Those still able to walk formed around the vehicles. The column began moving south under Marine air cover. Then, the first supporting aircraft dropped napalm short. Burning gasoline exploded near the column's head, injuring American soldiers and scattering men who had barely held formation. Faith pulled them together and forced the convoy forward. The road immediately began collecting payment. At a destroyed bridge, each vehicle had to be winched one at a time up a steep bypass while Chinese fire struck the trucks. Farther south, a roadblock near Hill 1221 stopped the column again. Soldiers climbed the slope through severe casualties, while wounded men waited below inside vehicles that could neither turn nor hide. By evening, the lights of Hagaruri were visible across the frozen reservoir. Safety could be seen. It could not be reached. Faith gathered a small group and attacked another roadblock. The defenders were driven back, but Faith was mortally wounded. His men placed him on the hood of a jeep and pushed onward. Then they reached another blown bridge. The ice could carry men, but not trucks. Organization collapsed. Soldiers who could move abandoned the vehicles and crossed the reservoir on foot. The wounded remained behind as machine guns and grenades struck the road. By darkness, on December 1, Task Force Faith had ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. Throughout the night, frostbitten survivors staggered into Hagaruri. Marine jeeps drove onto the ice and recovered about 319 men. Only a few hundred survivors were fit enough to be reorganized for combat. This was what the encirclement looked like when the system failed. Yet, the destruction carried a strategic consequence. Task Force Faith had held the Chinese 80th Division east of Chosin for 4 critical days. Without that resistance, those troops might have reached Hagaruri before the 5th and 7th Marines returned from Udamni. The force disappeared. The time it bought did not. By dawn on December 2, Hagaruri was filling with men who had escaped across the frozen reservoir. Some could still walk. Others had to be dragged from the ice. They entered a perimeter, crowded with artillery crews, engineers, clerks, cooks, drivers, wounded Marines, and survivors from units that no longer existed. Hagaruri was not a fortress by design. It had become one by necessity. The town sat at the reservoir's southern end. A rough airstrip lay below it. East Hill overlooked the perimeter, gun positions, and supply dumps. Roads ran north to Udamni and south toward Koto-ri. If East Hill remained in Chinese hands at daylight, observers on the crest could look directly into the airfield and artillery positions. On November 29, Major Reginald Myers assembled roughly 250 men from engineers, service troops, soldiers, and stragglers. They were divided into improvised squads and sent uphill after corsairs attacked. The slope was so icy that men fell before enemy fire reached them. Myers began with about 250. By the time his force reached the military crest, only around 75 remained with him. The Chinese still held the higher topographical crest, but had been denied complete control. Below the hill, engineers kept working. The manuals called for a runway about 3,900 feet long for C-47 transports at Hagaruri's altitude. Lieutenant Colonel John Partridge's engineers hoped 3,000 feet would be sufficient. They worked around the clock beneath floodlights. During one penetration, Chinese soldiers reached the edge of the strip. Engineers killed them, relit the lights, climbed back onto bulldozers, and resumed grading. The first C-47 landed at 2:30 in the afternoon on December 1. 30 minutes later, it lifted off with 24 casualties. 3 more transports followed. The last aircraft arrived carrying ammunition, collapsed its landing gear on the crude strip, and had to be destroyed. The airfield looked fragile. Its effect was enormous. Until then, helicopters and light aircraft had removed only limited numbers of casualties. Now twin-engine transports could carry litter patients out by the dozens while bringing ammunition, food, medical supplies, and radio equipment into the perimeter. On December 2, Smith recorded 919 casualties evacuated by air, most from the shattered army battalions east of the reservoir. At 7:35 in the evening on December 3, the advance guard of the 7th Marines reached Hagaruri from Udamni. Walking wounded followed. Trucks arrived through the night, with men laid across cargo beds, and even the hoods of jeeps. Another 1,000 casualties flew out on December 4. About 1,400 followed on December 5. When the division prepared to leave Hagaruri on December 6, no wounded remained waiting for evacuation. From the Chinese perspective, Hagaruri had looked like the weakest kind of target, a small base crowded with support personnel and wounded men. What they were attacking was the valve that allowed the surrounded force to breathe. Every aircraft that left removed weight from the road south. Every transport that landed brought the ammunition needed to open it. The perimeter did not survive because it was isolated. It survived because it was connected to the sky. At 8 on the morning of December 1, the breakout from Udamni had begun. It did not look like a retreat. It looked like several attacks moving in the same direction. The 5th Marines fought down the road. The 7th Marines moved across the ridges. Drivers and the critically wounded could ride. Most others walked. Before leaving, burial teams placed 85 dead Marines into frozen graves. 8 155mm howitzers were hooked to their prime movers near the rear of the convoy. The road south ran between hills numbered on military maps: 1,419, 1,542, 1,520, 1,653. Each height could hold machine guns above the vehicles. Each ravine could conceal another roadblock. A truck column below could not defend itself until rifle companies cleared the slopes on both sides. If the infantry failed to take one hill, the convoy behind it would become a line of stationary targets. That was the hidden geometry of the breakout. The wheels did not lead. The riflemen did. At one destroyed bridge south of Hill 1000, 520, Chinese machine gun fire stopped the advance. 12 corsairs attacked the ravine. An engineer platoon moved forward to patch the crossing. It had started the campaign with 48 men. Only 17 were still present. The bridge held. The column moved again. Movement came in bursts. A battalion climbed. Aircraft struck. Engineers cleared mines or rebuilt a crossing. Then trucks carrying ammunition, radios, wounded men, and artillery crawled through before Chinese troops could return to the high ground. On December 3, 6 Marine fighter bomber squadrons flew 145 sorties, most in direct support of the withdrawal. That evening, Davis formed his men into a route column outside Hagaruri. They entered singing the Marines' hymn. Inside the perimeter, mess crews served hot cakes, syrup, and coffee. Men who had slept in foxholes for 5 days held warm cups in hands blackened by cold and powder. Then the rear of the convoy reminded everyone that Udamni was not yet empty. At about 2 on the morning of December 4, the tractors hauling the 8 155mm howitzers ran out of diesel. The column stopped. Chinese troops attacked the immobilized rear guard. Fuel had to be pushed back through darkness, while riflemen and artillery crews fought to keep the guns from being abandoned. A few gallons of diesel now carried the weight of 8 artillery pieces, and everyone still behind them. By daylight, the last units reached Hagaruri. The first stage was over, but the force had only concentrated. Smith gave the regiments time to warm themselves, reorganize, and absorb survivors. Among them were 490 able-bodied army troops gathered into a provisional battalion from the wreckage east of the reservoir. Then the column turned south again. Koto Rai lay about 11 road miles away. At 7 on the morning of December 6, aircraft and artillery struck the heights around the exit from Hagaruri. At 9, Marine infantry attacked. East Hill was never completely taken, but its defenders were pushed far enough back for the division trains to pass. The 7th Marines led while the 5th protected the shrinking perimeter. Chinese troops reached grenade range of trucks after dark. Officers, riflemen, fuel, and time were being consumed. But the column was not breaking into separate fragments. The Chinese saw a long convoy struggling south. What they were fighting was a sequence: hill, aircraft, infantry, engineer, vehicle, then the same sequence again. By the morning of December 7, the force had reached Koto Ri. A retreating army had crossed hostile mountains by repeatedly attacking the ground in front of it. The fortress was no longer standing still. It was pulling itself south. At Koto Ri, the road south ended in a hole. Halfway down Funchilin Pass, the road clung to a cliff above 4 giant water pipes called penstocks. Chinese demolition teams had destroyed the bridge crossing them, leaving a gap roughly 20 feet wide. There was no usable bypass. Below the road was a ravine. Above it rose Hill 1081, whose bunkers commanded the bridge site. Behind the gap waited trucks, tanks, artillery tractors, ambulances, and wounded men. If the bridge could not be replaced, the division would have to abandon its heavy equipment or stop long enough for the encirclement to close again. Lieutenant Colonel John Partridge had seen the problem from the air on December 6. 4 sections of an M2 steel treadway bridge could span the opening. None were available on the mountain. The steel would have to come from the sky. A test section dropped at Yonpo shattered on impact. Partridge doubled the request. 8 sections would be dropped, allowing the engineers to lose half and still build the bridge. At 9:30 on December 7, Air Force C-119 flying boxcars released the 2,500-pound sections beneath parachutes. One drifted into Chinese lines, another struck hard and was damaged beyond use. 6 landed intact. The material had arrived. The road to it was still held by the enemy. The bridge site stood 3.5 miles from Koto Ri. Hill 1081 dominated the pass from the south, while Chinese positions covered the slopes north of the gap. Task Force DOG of the 3rd Infantry Division had pushed north to Chinhungni, but could not simply drive through. Infantry had to seize the high ground from both directions before the Brockway trucks could expose their cargo. The attacks began in a swirling snowstorm on December 8. From Chinhungni, Lieutenant Colonel Donald Schmuck's battalion climbed toward Hill 1081. One company took Hill 891, its southwestern nose. Another advanced along a narrow hogback ridge where men were forced into single file. From Koto Ri, The 7th Marines attacked south, clearing successive sections of high ground beside the road. If Hill 1081 remained occupied when the bridge sections arrived, engineers working below would be visible from the bunkers above. By nightfall, Marine units had broken the strongest positions controlling the pass. In one bunker, they found a kettle of rice still cooking. The defenders had been driven away, but not far. At first light, on December 9, Partridge released the Brockway trucks. They crawled south with the 6 surviving sections. At the gap, Army and Marine engineers rebuilt the abutments with sandbags and timbers. The trucks lowered steel treadways across the void. Plywood panels filled the center for wheeled vehicles. It took 3 hours. At 3:30 in the afternoon, Partridge drove his jeep back toward the column with the message that the bridge was ready. Around 6, the first vehicles began crossing. One by one, headlights moved over steel suspended above the penstocks. Trucks nearly slid from the narrow deck. Tanks crossed under their own weight. Ambulances followed. All night, the column continued. The Chinese had destroyed the road. The engineers had brought another road down from the sky. At 2:45 on December 10, the head of the column reached Chinhung Ni and Task Force Dog, but the escape was not complete. Near Sudong after midnight, Chinese soldiers emerged from houses with submachine guns and grenades and struck the vehicles of the 1st Marines. Truck drivers, stragglers, soldiers, and Marines fought between stalled vehicles. Lieutenant Colonel John U.D. Page, an Army artillery officer, took command and was killed. The column lost trucks and a personnel carrier before the road was cleared by dawn. The final door had almost closed after the key had already turned, yet the system held. Infantry seized the ridges. Aircraft delivered the steel. Engineers rebuilt the crossing. Task Force Dog kept the lower road open. An encirclement designed to destroy isolated units had been defeated by units that refused to operate in isolation. By December 11, the last organized elements from the Chosin column had reached the Hamhung-Hungnam perimeter. Behind them, the reservoir belonged to the Chinese. The United Nations advance into northeastern Korea had ended. X-Corps was withdrawing by sea. The attempt to reach the Yalu and reunify Korea by force had collapsed beneath an intervention its commanders had underestimated. That was a Chinese campaign victory, but it was incomplete. More than 11,000 Marines and roughly 1,000 Army soldiers had come out of the Chosin area, with much of their artillery, vehicles, and organization intact. The Chinese 9th Army Group had separated and encircled the force, yet had not annihilated the isolated units one by one. Udam Ni had not fallen quickly enough. Hagaruri had remained open. The roadblocks had not held together. At Funchilin Pass, even a destroyed bridge had failed to become the final wall. The cost remained visible at Hungnam. On December 13, after the 5th and 7th Marines had loaded aboard ships, Oliver P. Smith stopped at the division cemetery. Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish chaplains stood together. Rifles fired farewell volleys. A bugler sounded taps over the graves of men who would not make the voyage south. During the Chosin campaign, 714 Marines had been killed or died of wounds. Army units east of the reservoir had suffered destruction on an even more concentrated scale. Thousands more carried frostbite, wounds, and memories that would outlast the frozen mountains. Then the harbor began emptying. The wider Hungnam evacuation moved approximately 105,000 troops, more than 98,000 civilians, 17,500 vehicles, and about 350,000 measurement tons of cargo out of northeastern Korea. On December 24, the final forces left as demolition charges tore through the docks behind them. The Chinese had retaken the ground. The survivors had denied them the army trapped upon it. That is the irony of Chosin. It was not a battlefield victory that preserved the offensive. The offensive was finished. It was an operational escape that preserved the force for the war that followed. The final image is not a flag beside the reservoir. It is a column disappearing toward the sea with its wounded, its guns, and proof that encirclement is complete only when the surrounded force stops functioning. At Chosin, survival was not the absence of defeat. It was the refusal to let defeat become destruction. Subscribe for more hidden turning points where terrain, logistics, and one overlooked decision changed the fate of a war.